Good afternoon. My name is Timothy Williams, and first we'd like to welcome you to a community gathering. We had an incident occur on Sunday morning that heightened awareness, created angst, but also provided what we believe is an opportunity, a teaching moment. Fortunately, the incident didn't escalate to the level where there was significant injury and harm to anyone, but it had all of the characteristics of volatility. And it's something that is not unique to us, but we in this community feel its uniqueness. It's personal, it's close to home, and fortunately we have a very good relationship with law enforcement in our community. So this isn't the first conversation. I received a phone call yesterday. Many of us are in constant dialogue with law enforcement, with city officials, on how our community functions as a whole. And so we felt very good that there were folks who called us. We didn't read about it in the newspaper. We didn't hear about it on the radio. And we were able to respond to them. We gathered some community leaders from our faith community, from our civic community, and then just some concerned folks. And we met this morning for about an hour for a briefing, shared some of our concerns, some of our angst, and figured out a pathway forward so that we can address these issues as they're occurring in our community. We have with us the NAACP representation, the Lorain County Urban League representation, the ministers, the Clergy Association from Lorain, a variety of other pastors and faith leaders in the community, members from the police department, members from the city government, a very eclectic, collective group of community leadership. And so we want to make sure that, again, this is not our final response. This has spawned a conversation that needs to be ongoing. But without any further ado, I'd like to bring Mayor Chase Rittenhour, who is part of our community, our mayor, and he's going to have some comments, and he will then bring in some of our law enforcement officials, and we'll continue from there. Mr. Mayor? Thank you.
Well, as Pastor indicated, this past Sunday we had an incident that could have escalated and turned into something much different than it was, and really had things gone differently on either side, that could have been the case. And what's going to be discussed here today, I think, is just an example of an ongoing conversation that has been occurring with our Lorain Police Department and many of our civic groups, organizations, and leaders. And that's the important thing. It needs to be a dialogue, and it needs to be an ongoing dialogue. We've put together a citizens committee that has just formed in this past year. We've got a strategic plan that's occurring, and we've also had numerous discussions with community leaders, with our police chief, and an open door policy that, regardless of whether there's an incident or whether there's not, it's important to have those discussions and that dialogue, and that's why we're here today. It's being proactive. It's getting those leaders in the community together to talk about what really are tough issues sometimes to talk about. But with the help of law enforcement, as well as our leadership in the community, we're in this together, ultimately. And I think that's what today symbolizes. I think that's what the efforts of the past several years with the partnership with the Lorain Police Department and those in the community symbolizes. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to one of our leaders in the police department who's got a little bit more specifics on the incident and what our plan of action is going forward, and that's our Captain, Roger Watkins.
Hello. Saturday evening going into Sunday morning, 2:35 in the morning, we received a call for assistance, shots fired on 19th Court. Officers responded, and while in response, learned that there was actually a shooting victim at 2013 West 19th Court. I apologize. The officer got there, not knowing what exactly was happening, encountered a gentleman who walked out of 2013 19th Court, instructed that gentleman, Mr. Cooper, to stop. Mr. Cooper elected to flee, believing that Mr. Cooper was the suspect. The officer again told him to stop, pursued Mr. Cooper, who attempted to enter a residence. The officer again told him he was under arrest. At that time, Mr. Cooper surrendered himself and was handcuffed. And if that was the end of it, that would have been pretty much the end of it. Mr. Cooper probably realized his mistake of running in the first part, because it turns out he was not the suspect, and surrendered. However, at that point, Mr. Cooper's girlfriend intervened in the arrest, pushed the officer. At the same time, 6 to 7 people tried to surround the police officer. The officer drew his handgun, escorted Mr. Cooper, who is his arrestee, out of the area, tried to back him towards the cover of the cruiser, instructed everybody to stay back. The crowd, those 6 or 7 people, and the girlfriend then knocked on a door and enlisted the assistance of 7 other people who tried to surround the police officer, and someone in the crowd said, "Charge him," instructing the crowd to charge the police officer. The police officer put his handgun towards the crowd, held them at bay until the cavalry arrived and broke up the crowd. While this was happening, it turns out Mr. Cooper was not the shooting suspect, but while this was happening, we had a shooting victim who was laying inside 2013 West 19th Court bleeding and who was not being assisted. We also had the shooting suspect flee the scene. While this officer is dealing with this incident, the shooting suspect was actually able to flee, and he is at large in the community, believed to be armed with a handgun. Your press release should have given you his name and a picture. Because Mr. Cooper realized his mistake and stopped, he was charged with the lesser crime of obstructing official business. His girlfriend, who chose to push the police officer, was charged with resisting the arrest of another. I would like to say it is not an option for community members to interfere with the arrest of another. Okay, it is never permissible for citizens to menace or attempt to attack a police officer. I feel very grateful that this officer, Officer Zubko, used restraint in the situation. No amount of training could have possibly prepared a police officer to physically defend himself and his arrestee against 14 to 15 people who were attacking him. Again, I applaud his restraint and the restraint of members of that crowd who didn't follow the foolish advice of a friend and charge an armed police officer. I was concerned about the possible volatility of this situation, and myself and Pastor Williams had a conversation. I think police officers we're members of the community. I'm a member of the community myself. I've lived here my entire life. Live and work in the community. You have to understand, as community members, as police officers, we are employed by the community to respond to emergency situations, to defuse them, assist, injure the injured, etc. And other options could have been handled. If the crowd doesn't like what's happening, that this young man, who they are obviously aware was not the shooter, although my police officer did not know that, use patience, step back, let the officer handle what he's doing. This could have been diffused twice. At the very first part where that officer informed him to stop, if he would have stopped, this would have been diffused in seconds. When he fled and surrendered himself, actually this was diffused then. The officer could have just taken this a step back, figured out the situation, assisted the shooting victim, assisted in the arrest of the shooting suspect. However, the crowd escalated this to the point where this could have endangered the police officer, the crowd itself, and the community in general. As a community member, as a police officer, I was concerned, as was Pastor Williams, that the community in danger of the community, and I think our objective is just to keep people safe. We want to keep the community safe. We want to keep people safe when we respond to these incidents. Pastor?
If the members of the community who were gathered this morning, if you just come up and gather around, we'll be very brief. Mayor, Fowler. Captain, please. We thought it was very important that that you see the reflection of who's been in this conversation. This has not been a conversation in isolation. This represents citizenship, membership, leadership of our respective community, and we're very concerned. We're concerned about the safety of our citizens and our police officers. We're concerned that there are certain behaviors that are not typical. We normally don't see a type of mob response. We really want to applaud the individuals who first took the wrong step, but then did not escalate this any further. We support law enforcement 100% in the job that they have to do, and we say don't break the law, understand what your rights are, understand what your response should be. But also we understand that there is a culture that's somewhat disconnected, and we are committed to trying to reach out and figure out how do we communicate, how do we better understand each other, how do we better trust each other so that what could have happened doesn't happen. We had a very near miss, and so we feel that we were given an opportunity with that near miss to have our sentence heightened, but to make sure that we have a response. So we will be in further communication. Again, these are the individuals, pastors, lay leaders, community leaders. We're really concerned, and so we will again thank the police department for giving us the call. In some communities that doesn't happen. In this community it does. We're grateful that this wasn't our first conversation, and it won't be our last. Any comments from anyone? We stand together, unified. This is our community. We will protect our community. We will help police our community. We'll help hold our community accountable, because ultimately we want to have a safe environment for our kids to grow up in and for us to live in. So thank you, and that's it.
Are you going to go out into the neighborhoods and try to talk to them?
Yes. What we did today is we had a first gathering to be briefed. We already have some things that we've discussed that we need to do in the community. We will definitely be doing some outreach. We want to talk to, hopefully, individuals who were involved in an incident. There's a peripheral community, but those individuals involved, they probably have a sense of how escalated that was. I'm sure they have a lot of anxiety. I mean, there's guns out. So again, we want to reach out to them and figure out why is it you're responding that way? What are some of the things that we can do so that you have a better sense of trust? We want to build a bridge. We know many of these folks in our community. There's a sense of trust that they have with us, and so we want to be a bridge between law enforcement and the community so that these things don't occur. And again, there's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of simple things that people don't know what their response should be in the presence of law enforcement. And so we want to make sure they're very clear objectively on what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do. But also we want to make sure we understand that the culture that they're living in, and then we're going to bring that information back to law enforcement. Law enforcement will be part of the conversation, but we believe this. We have to be the bridge, and we have to present law enforcement to this community in a way that's not threatening, and also in a way that gives them credibility, because we believe that if we are representing and we present them, then if we have any credibility, that'll support that conversation. Any other questions? Anyone can take these.
You mentioned that there's meetings ongoing. Are those meetings open to the public? Has anyone come to those?
By all means, what we did first is we had an intimate meeting. We didn't have a huge public meeting because we wanted to get some information and some details, and we wanted to be able to craft a response. So I would fully anticipate that these will be public meetings because it's a public issue. This is not a police issue. It's not a faith issue. It's not a social service issue. It's a community issue. So if we aren't going to have a community dialogue, we're going to be less effective, we believe, in coming up with solutions. So we will announce those meetings. Some of these will be private conversations. Some of them will be anybody up here, other folks who know folks one-on-one. We believe that we have to reach out to a community at large, but we believe also that if there are individuals to be communicated with, whatever means we have of communicating, we're going to use all of those.
How does this fit into the larger conversation that the nation has been having about police interactions with minorities and other communities in terms of Black Lives Matter and the so-called war on police?
Wow. I can say this. We can't speak for the nation. What we can say here is in our community that here's what's been identified by our police chief, and I can quote him pretty specifically. We've been meeting, and we feel that there is a very healthy relationship with folks probably 35, 40, and up with law enforcement. But there's also an awareness that with the generation younger, there is not the same kind of connection. So what law enforcement has been doing is trying to figure out how do we connect with that age demographic. They have a very different perspective than perhaps their parents, very different relationships. So part of it is really trying to connect to them and understanding culturally where they are and how they view law enforcement and how they view society, how they view their rights. We're not getting into discussions about whose lives matters. We believe that everyone's lives matter. We're not reducing anything. Those movements that are out there are responses. And we have our own response. We like to believe that our response is somewhat unique to us and is kind of, I would guess, we're customized. And we're aware of those things out there. We're aware of those perceptions. We're aware of those realities. But we believe here in our community, we're ahead of the 8 ball. We've had conversations in the past. This is not our first conversation. And we've established relationships and communication lines. So we feel that this is just an extension. And again, because of this specific situation, it brought a heightened sense of awareness. Probably 5 years ago, 100 men and the police chief and some folks met because of incidents that occurred. So we have been in ongoing conversations, and what we see is every now and then things escalate, and then they kind of dip down and they re-escalate. But during those times of escalation and de-escalation, we're still in constant conversation. So we feel pretty comfortable that our relationships are healthy enough that we can be effective in communicating.
Thank you very much, sir.
Good to see you. How are you doing?